Good day, participants. Good day, panelists. My name is Joanne Jones. I'm the Communications Director at the EITI. It's a huge pleasure to welcome a very distinguished panel here today, very diverse panel, and also fantastically interesting topics. So today's Transparency Matters webinar is going to focus on transparency, good governance, and the rise of the renewable sector. It is an opportunity to explore some of the challenges and potential solutions to current and potential future governance issues in the renewable energy sector. I think the EITI's role in promoting transparency and good governance in the extractive sector is well known, and I think a very good springboard to explore this area. So for the information of participants online today, this webinar is being recorded. Although you are all muted, we would really encourage your participation in the form of putting questions to our panel in the chat or in the Q&A function, and we will try and leave a good time for discussion at the end of a good period of time for discussion at the end of the webinar. Interpretation is available in French and Spanish. And a fun fact today is that we have over 200 people registered for the webinar, and that they come from 50 countries, so very diverse audience as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our moderator today, that is Maya de Vibe. Thank you, Maya. Please take us forward.
Thank you, Joanne. Dear participants, it's a real pleasure to be with you today, and we have a fantastic panel of experts to share thoughts with you on this important topic. Before I introduce you to the panelists, I would like to just say a few words by way of introduction on why this topic is of critical importance for all of us and for me personally. I recently visited the west coast of Norway, where a couple of wind farms have been put up, and standing in front of those massive turbines, I was filled predominantly with a sense of positivity about the future and what the future will bring. And these towers and the broader renewable energy transition is the most important part of solving the climate crisis. But with every solution also comes some challenges. And as financial flows shift in massive quantities towards the renewable sector, they unfortunately bring with them some known governance problems. And this has been a pattern with every natural resource boom in history. And I think there is a very real risk that we will see a repeat of some of those problems also for the renewable boom. There are very high profile and interesting illustrations of this that go some time back even. We have the Italian court proceedings from 2013 that resulted in as much of a third of the Sicilian wind farms at the time being seized due to links to organized crime. And there was the investigation in Germany 3 years ago that confirmed large-scale fraud in wind projects with damages of around €500 million for several large investors. These wind farms didn't only existed on paper, and the fraud was only discovered when one of the investors' employees called the local council to get more information about the project, only to find out that it never existed. And one might dismiss these as one-offs and not a systemic challenge, but our experience suggests that we may be facing an emerging larger problem. I work at Statkraft, the largest generator of renewable energy in Europe. We're present in over 20 countries, and we've been in this game right from the start, nearly 130 years now. And business ethics has always been high on our agenda, a high importance for our management team. And it is with sadness that we observe through processes we work on, such as acquiring companies or portfolios of projects or individual projects, that unfortunately in many of the countries we operate, we see problems related to weaknesses in governance and accountability. We see problems around straightforward corruption in small and large scale. And we also see numerous examples of more complex arrangements around corporate structuring and tax evasion, which clearly threaten the very principle of a just transition in terms of where the benefits end up. And these challenges, for whatever reason they emerge, they bring with them a wider set of interconnected governance challenges that I know the panelists will touch upon today. And I think the important part of a discussion like this is that the solution can clearly only be found as a collective endeavor across the sector involving multiple participants from various areas, governments, civil society and companies. And that is why I'm very pleased to have with me today a panel that represents those different constituents within the sector. So we have Phil Blumer, who is the Executive Director of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. We have Pamela Morales, the National Coordinator of EITI Argentina, Jensi Turpo, who's the National Coordinator of EITI Albania, and Kate Wallace, who's the Head of Sustainability at SSE Renewables. So I'd like to start with you, Phil. You've worked extensively on governance challenges in the renewable sector, specifically related to human rights. What are your thoughts on the challenges around governance and accountability in this sector, and how might we be able to tackle those challenges?
Thanks, Maya. As we all know, we are standing on the edge of a precipice regarding the climate emergency that is developing so fast in front of our eyes. The IPCC has been very clear in its latest report that our best chance is a massive increase in renewable energy, 6-fold increase in solar, 4-fold increase in wind. And that is going to take a massive investment in renewable energy itself, as well as the supply chain. And that involves the transition minerals, obviously, copper, cobalt, lithium, manganese, zinc, nickel, as well as the actual installation of the renewable and its operations. All that is going to take a huge amount of land. These are land-hungry industries, as you've already pointed out. And from our perspective, we are only going to get the fast transition that we need if there's also a semblance of fairness to that transition. That means the business model that needs to be deployed is one that really delivers a sense of co-benefit and a delivery of shared prosperity as well as climate security. So at present, we see far too many delays emerging, particularly in regions and countries of lower levels of governance. Real enormous numbers of suspensions, blockades, protests, both around the renewable energy as well as around transition mineral mining. And that's because there is a sense amongst many communities that are affected in terms of that land that there is no co-benefit and there is no shared prosperity emerging from this. And we cannot allow the renewable energy thrust now to replicate the problems that have dogged the mining and extractive industries for so long in terms of the scale of community distrust. Our own transition mineral tracker, for instance, demonstrates that there's been 500 allegations of human rights abuse. The leading category of that is the abuse of communities, particularly land and water, as well as attacks on human rights defenders and environmental defenders. A third of all that abuse and allegations are related to the human rights and environmental defenders themselves, and particularly Indigenous leaders being disproportionately affected and attacked. But that's also reflected in the renewable energy installation, unfortunately. And again, we've got the scale and scope of that, 370 allegations of attacks. That's mostly with hydro, but nevertheless, it's also with wind and solar as well. And again, it's land issues, it's water issues that are particularly important. So, and when we do our renewable energy benchmarking the major asset holders in renewable energy, again, these land-hungry industries, not one company had policies committing to respecting the land rights in their own operations. And all companies scored 0 in their commitment to protect human rights defenders and environmental defenders. That was a year ago. We're going to do one this year, and we hope it's a lot better. So we're optimistic. But what this does demonstrate is that the governance challenges are acute. They're the issues of transparency and corruption, as you rightly mentioned, but it's also that fundamental relationship with the communities and the countries that they're involved in.
Thank you very much, Phil, for sharing those perspectives. And with that range of challenges that you highlight and identify, what do you think the role could be for different actors in working together on resolving this, as sometimes these might appear as quite there might be conflicts in a way between positions across stakeholders, but what's the potential for looking for ways to collaborate across stakeholders on these challenges? Yeah.
So, I mean, fundamental to the solutions that we see, and we do see genuine solutions, but renewable energy companies are out ahead often of the transition of the mineral sector in finding those solutions. So we're optimistic that those solutions are being found, but they need to be generalized across the sector, and indeed inform, we would argue, the transition mineral sector. So, for instance, but nevertheless, there's still substantial problems, unfortunately. Too many renewable energy projects that we are in, we're receiving allegations from enormous wind farms, solar farms, and an enormous power line going straight from there, from the lands of Maasai people or Turkana people or indigenous people in America, in Latin America. Huge power lines going straight to the capital, and not even a trickle to provide lighting in the communities where those installations are set. We cannot continue with that kind of situation where there's a sense of the harming of people's livelihoods through those enormous installations, and yet the difficulty of them not receiving any sense of benefit. So there's a great opportunity now to really start to engage with rights holders and as key stakeholders in this piece. And that's where we're seeing exciting new models emerge, where renewable energy companies, as well as emergent in transition minerals, where there's a genuine sense of starting to look at new models that can bring that shared prosperity. Reimagining that business in terms of changed models of ownership. Communities no longer are prepared to say, oh, well, you're going to build a small school for me and maybe a health clinic that probably won't be manned for very long. They want to see a sense of ownership, and they're prepared to take the risks and opportunities and benefits that can come with that ownership. So we're seeing renewable energy companies starting to develop models of co-ownership where the communities that grant their land, the use of their land, gain a stake in the actual operations, gain a sense of co-ownership, and therefore also co-management, and therefore with that a sense of self-determination, but also a predictable revenue stream into their own communities. There's difficulties with that. It takes education. We all know the resource curse, but many Indigenous communities need a real sense of training and understanding so that they are also prepared for the benefits and the disbenefits when things, when there's a downturn in the market, etc. But they want to take those risks as well and not simply be treated as they have for the last 500 years as essentially discriminated against, or as children, to use the appalling term that was used in the past. And so again, the models that we're seeing emerging in Canada, in New Zealand, now even in Kenya. In Kenya, it's many of these models emerge because of the level of protest and suspensions that come because communities are not prepared to tolerate that treatment again. But nevertheless, there is that move forward into these new models. Kenya gets 70% of its power from renewable energy, and there's been so many disputes and suspensions, and yet now there are models of co-ownership emerging, as I say, and Canada is leading the way in much of that. But that's because the Indigenous people have title that has to be recognised. But we've got, I think the other thing I'd mention, so alongside the investors and the companies and the rights holders, there's also governments, and you will know as well as I do, that governments are now looking much more assertively, or at least democratic governments are looking much more assertively at the regulatory structures that are necessary to ensure that there is that market signal to genuinely contribute to shared prosperity. And so that regulatory standard that's coming now very strongly in the European Union is starting to be replicated and delivered in other places, even for instance with Sierra Leone and Kenya, with new land acts that protect communities and give them the free, prior and informed consent that must be being respected. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Phil. I think that gives a lot of food for thought. And many of these topics, I'm sure, Kate, have been on your agenda as well, working for a company that has had a lot of focus on just transition topics for some time. So I'd like to ask you, from your perspective, sitting in a company that has huge growth ambitions, what do you see as the role that you can play as a company in terms of driving good governance standards?
Brilliant, and thank you, Maya, for inviting to speak here today, and hello everyone that's dialed in as well. So yes, I'm Kate Wallis-Lockhart, I'm Head of Sustainability for SSE Renewables, and for those that don't know SSE Renewables, we're a renewables developer, owner and operator with our home markets in the UK and Ireland, but we're expanding, as Maya said, at pace into international markets as well. So over the next decade, we're planning to increase our renewable output by 5 times, and we're currently building more offshore wind than any other company in the world. So I think that's probably the first point almost that I would make, is that the scale of the transformation, really not just transition, is absolutely enormous. And the level, just, yeah, exactly as Phil said, the level of change that we're going to see from a renewables perspective is just enormous. So I think there's this temptation now, and I've seen this definitely, recently since coming into our renewables business at SSE, is that there can be a bit of a temptation to think that the renewables sector is actually quite well developed, that we've got well established supply chains because there just has been such a huge level of growth already. But when we look about where we actually need to get to, we are completely still in our infancy. And I think that's, there's positives and negatives, right, from all of this, but I think the positive here is that we actually do have that opportunity to think about how we want to do things going forward, and to learn from other extractive sectors as well that have kind of been through these transitions and dealt with these issues in the past as well, and think maybe a bit differently on how we want to do it as well as we move forward. Now, the other point I'd say is around this openness and transparency being absolutely critical, and certainly, to Phil's point about investors being a central element of that as well, and also governments. But when we're dealing with renewable supply chains, right, they're big, they're complex, and we need to have full transparency going right down the chain. So right down thinking to that extractives point. A great example that of project we've been working on with one of our suppliers is to really get right back to source on copper. So right back to a copper mine in Sweden, actually, that's staffed 40% by female workers. It uses all renewable electricity. So actually, as well as decarbonising that copper for the cables that are going to supply one of our major offshore wind farms, we're thinking about actually what are the conditions and what are the labour conditions at that site as well. But that's one example in a massive, massive supply chain too. And we know that it is really complicated, and there can be these brilliant pockets, but there's a lot more to do as well. And I think from a renewables developer perspective in the private sector, another thing that we're really focused on, and I've actually just brought resource into my team, is all around sustainable supply chains and digitalisation, how we think about that going forward as well. There are a lot of tools in the toolbox now for increasing transparency, recording, reporting as well. And I think that, collaboration in this space between different private actors as well as with governments and other institutions, like the EITI is absolutely critical to making sure that we're all recording things in a similar way and reporting them in the same way as well. This point around standardization is really holding us back now, and we all know that we need to get to the same point. So yes, as you said, SSE has been really, really focused on this idea of a just transition. So it was a a big focus at COP this year, which was interesting to see because it's actually something that SSE has been working on for about 3 years now. So not long in the grand scheme of things, but certainly maybe a little bit longer than other actors. So 2 years ago, we published the world's first business just transition strategy. And what that does is it outlines 20 principles for SSE to guide our decision-making and behaviour as we transition out of high carbon activities, whilst at the same time transition into a net zero world. And really, for context, SSE, big renewables developer now. That wasn't always the case. We actually closed our last coal-fired power station in 2020 only. And, 10 years ago, we were about a third gas, third coal, third renewables. And now we have no coal whatsoever. And we still have some flexible low carbon gas, but we are absolutely increasing that proportion of renewables as well. So it's this idea that, the transition or transformation doesn't happen, one thing then the other. Both are happening at the same time. And we really need to work out what does that mean for human beings in the widest sense. So what does it mean for workers, for communities, for consumers, and how can we best share the positive impacts and opportunities of a transition to net zero, whilst making sure that the unfair elements don't unfairly fall on those with least as well. And then the next thing that we did on Just Transition was really to hone in on the worker story specifically. And we worked with our trade union partners, with our workforce, with government, with all sorts of different skills institutions to really think about how can we support a just transition for workers specifically. And I guess that's probably the final point I wanted to make with relevance to what private sector can do, is that we absolutely have accountability, and we need to make sure that we are delivering the change in a way that protects workers as well as the wider natural environment and people in all sorts of ways. But we can't do it in isolation. We need to have clear actions and accountabilities from governments and from wider industry and other actors too. And hopefully it's, we all know where we need to get to and why, and it shouldn't be beyond the wit of us to come together on that common goal too.
That's great, Kate. If I can just follow up with a quick follow-up question on the topic that you ended on there, with there would be a concern, I think, for some of the more responsible actors, that given the level of maturity of the sector as a whole, that there are still quite a lot of commercial actors that cut corners and use practices that are less than responsible. How do you see the role of government in terms of ensuring a level playing field, so to speak, with clear enough standards and frameworks to ensure that all companies are held to account to the same standard?
Yeah, so I think it's a really, really good question. And I suppose the way I see it is that definitely responsible companies and investors actually can see the value of behaving in a sustainable way and thinking to the future and your wider impacts. But at the same time, there are certainly commercial considerations that we need to consider at the same time. And if we look at some experiences of certain models for incentivizing renewables build out in certain countries, there has been this focus on price and bringing down prices, which obviously serves a really important social value. But at the same time, does that mean that other things are being compromised on? Does it mean that labour standards, living wages, fair work, human rights pieces, environmental focus, local content, all these things, what are the trade-offs involved if the primary focus is just on price? So what we need from government is to set those social safeguards and standards, and I suppose be the tide that raises all ships, right? And create this, even playing field for us all to deliver projects in the same responsible way. And actually there's an interesting point around not just preventing bad behaviour, but also incentivizing good behaviour as well. So, for example, SSE, we're a fair tax accredited company. We have been for the last almost a decade. What that means is that we absolutely pay the right amount of tax in the right place at the right time, give full transparency and very detailed disclosure over all of our taxes. Paying tax is fundamental to a just transition, and we should be rewarding those types of companies that are absolutely committed to ruling out the use of tax havens and things like that, and making sure that they're contributing to those local economies and societies too, because that's how we're going to get to net zero in a fair and just way.
That's great, Kate. Thank you so much, and for giving me a nice bridge across to Jency on the importance of having good frameworks in place for transparency, both on the reporting side, but obviously transparency around taxation and benefits generated from this sector. Renewables are important for Albania. We know that as a company that has had very important projects on hydropower in Albania. So it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts, Jency, on both what you've been focused on in Albania from the government side around this and where you see it going forward.
Thank you, Maya. I would like to make a short presentation on the overview for the Albanian energy sector, and including in this also the renewable sector and the plans for the future. And for sure, I will touch a little bit also the fact that in the difference with the other countries, with the other EITI countries, we have included also the hydropower sector in the EITI report, which is new, based also on the fact that Albania is based on the hydropower regarding the energy that it needs. So let's say that Albania has a high potential of renewable energy sources, which are the main energy factors for our country. The use of such sources for energy production represent a long-term objective for the implementation of 3 objectives of energy policies in our country. And these 3 objectives are the support for the overall economic development, the increase for the security of energy supply, and the other thing is the environmental protection. The renewable energy is the solution for the decrease of this strategic dependence on the imports and the improvement not only for the security of energy supply, but even for the macroeconomic and the political security of the country. Albanian government through years had considered to increase the profits of the country from the hydrologic potential through the process of liberalization of concessions from the private investments. So in 2060, the National Agency of Natural Resources in Albania had reported the building process of 451 small hydropower centrals. Through a process of giving license through concessions, there were probably about 245 concessions that created the possibility that for that year, 33% of these hydropower centrals have begun producing energy for our country. Albania government has been focused on the diversification of its supply with energy and the promotion of other renewable energy resources like biomass, solar energy, and wind energy. Thanks to our geography, because we are in the middle of Balkans and we are close to the Mediterranean, we have a very good situation with sunny days. So Albania has almost 300 sunny days that create the possibility of using the sun energy for the idea of having more and more resources of producing energy for our country. The power system is in our country is based on hydropower. Albania has a considerable hydropower potential, and only 35% of that potential is used right now. But the fact that we are dependent from the hydropower also means that the renewable generation is very sensitive because of the climate situation, which means that we have this kind of dependence. As I have already told you, there are some other potentials like solar, like wind, like geothermal sources that Albania can use in the future just for producing more and more energy and having the dependence from, because as you know, most of the countries from the situation of war in Ukraine have a kind of dependence of let's say gas or any other things. But Albania has not this kind of problem because we are specified in the hydropower energy, which means that this gives to us a possibility to work on and to create more other possibilities in the future for having let's say a sustainable climate regarding the renewable resources. As I already told to you, EITI Albania, based on the fact that the hydropower is our main source of energy, had included hydro energy sector in the EITI reporting. And we are planning in the future to include also other areas of renewable to the reporting. So in our transparency reports from 2013 until now, there is a specific part that includes the hydropower sector. In total, through different years, we have selected 17 hydroenergetic companies that have included also the Albanian Electroenergetic Corporation to report. These companies represent 90% of the energy produced in the country. And all the companies totally agreed to publish in our report their data. I can say that these companies are really accountable for a part of their work. It is specified in our EITI report. And this report, as you know, is published every year. Also, other relevant government institutions do their part to help the sector very accountable. And also, I have to specify that our government is doing a very good job in the field of transparency in the energy policy making. For the Albanian government, the challenge right now includes the harmonization of legal framework on the energy sector and the extractive sector with our European directives, consumer protection, energy efficiency promotion, and increasing the utilization of renewable sources. By the other part, our government has a target to guarantee the private and the private-public investments in our country, specifically for the renewable energy investments. The ministry that is in charge for this is the Ministry of Infrastructure and Energy, and is responsible for making a policy, a public policy, and monitoring the implementation of legislation in the hydropower sector. The mission of our ministry in the energy sector is to promote a consistent and sustainable economic development through offering a secure path for the private investment, domestic or foreign, in the energy sector with attractive legal climate for this investment. The ministry right now has worked for creating harmonization in the energy efficiency and the promotion of renewable energy resources. We have implemented a new legislation that is let's say, partially transposed the European directive for 2009 that offers or grants the support of renewable energy producers through a tendering procedure based on contracts for different on top of the market price of electricity. It also incorporates an auction scheme for renewable capacity greater than 2 megawatts, that net metering scheme for photovoltaic panels on the rooftop with a capacity of up to 500 kilowatts. So I can say that our government is doing a very good job in this situation that the whole world is facing right now. We are let's say, trying to implement or to guarantee a possibility for the investors that are coming from abroad and also from the Albanian investors to invest in the renewable sector. And as I've already told you in our EITI report, in the future, for sure, we will include more and more companies that work in the field of renewable sources that can produce energy in Albania. And for sure, as I have already told you, these companies that we have worked right now are very accountable, and they accept the way how EITI is working for presenting their data to the public and for offering more transparency for Albania and also for abroad.
Thank you so much, Jensi. That's super useful to get that background on your setup. Could I just ask you a super quick follow-up question so we still have time for Pamela and Q&A. Do you think that it matters for the level of support from the public for new projects that there is this higher level of transparency around where the resources flow from these projects?
I think that EITI right now has incorporated for the next year some projects that will increase the level of transparency, also for giving more opportunities to the public to be more in touch with the project that our government has. So one of the projects, for example, that we have is to make a study, I believe for the 2023, for creating a clear situation about the investments that are coming in our country. What are the good things and the bad things that our legislation is having right now? And so in this way, we can create a possibility for changing the legislation and for giving more guarantees to the investors that are coming from abroad to come in Albania and to invest in this sector. So I believe that we will need for sure to have a situation of new projects in the field of transparency for guaranteeing the investors and for giving more transparency to the public and to everyone that needs to have information on this.
That's great. Thank you so much for that follow-up, Jensi. If I could then turn to you, Pamela, for a follow-up along a similar vein of questions. You obviously have a lot of mining activities in Argentina, and mining provides really important input factors to renewable projects. If you could share a little bit about how you have worked with the EITI framework to influence good governance in the mining sector in the Argentinian context, that would be very interesting for us to hear.
Gracias, Maya. Voy a hablar en español, así que actívense la interpretación. Mira, la pregunta es sumamente importante porque en primer lugar tenemos que saber que Argentina es un país federal. ¿Esto qué quiere decir? Argentina tiene 23 provincias y la Ciudad Autónoma de Buenos Aires. Esto implica además que las provincias son las dueñas de los recursos naturales. Entonces, el trabajo vinculado al sector minero, al sector energético y todo lo que tiene que ver con lo que venimos hablando y mis colegas estuvieron mencionando, el tema de la gobernanza, de la transparencia, de la rendición de cuentas y de los derechos humanos, es clave tener en cuenta este contexto, que es un contexto federal como primer punto. El desafío que tenemos en Argentina para trabajar con esta dimensión federal, ustedes saben que Argentina además en el último tiempo está siendo foco de un boom de inversiones vinculado a la demanda de los minerales que van a ser necesarios para este contexto que fue mencionado anteriormente de transición energética. Esto generó un gran interés inversor en el país. Argentina forma parte junto con Chile y Bolivia de lo que se llama el Triángulo del Litio, y ese Triángulo del Litio hoy tiene el 65% de los recursos mundiales del litio. Esto pone de manera, ilumina de una manera como muy importante que antes quizás no se venía dando a la Argentina como un país minero que puede proveer las materias primas para la transición energética, es decir, los minerales que necesita el mundo. Y para esto, desde el gobierno y los gobiernos federales, porque esto también es importante tener en cuenta, desde el nivel nacional tiene la función de articular la mirada global del sector minero, pero los que gestionan estrictamente los proyectos mineros en territorio son las provincias. Entonces, uno de los desafíos importantes tiene que ver con esa articulación entre el nivel nacional y el nivel provincial, ¿sí? Para poder desarrollar la minería que queremos, que es una minería responsable, una minería que genere arraigo en las comunidades y que forme parte de las comunidades. Esto me parece clave, se mencionó anteriormente, es decir, para nosotros trabajar junto con las comunidades en lo que se llama acá la licencia social o el consenso social es fundamental. porque no todas las provincias que tienen recursos mineros hoy tienen la licencia social que permite desarrollar la actividad en el territorio. Entonces, esto es otro de los puntos claves que necesitamos trabajar con las provincias, el tema de la licencia, y como parte de esa licencia, una de las grandes demandas que existe el sector es la demanda de transparencia y la demanda de información, de generación de datos. Algo que venimos trabajando desde distintas, podríamos decir, herramientas que tenemos en el gobierno nacional. EITI es una herramienta clave. Argentina adhiere en el 2019 y la verdad que fue una herramienta fundamental para el diálogo con el sector privado, con la sociedad civil, y ahora el gran desafío que tenemos es la conversación con las provincias para que las provincias formen parte de la iniciativa. Otra de las medidas que estamos haciendo para trabajar el tema de la licencia social y la transparencia es una mesa abierta sobre minería a la comunidad. Son encuentros federales donde recorremos distintas provincias y llevamos especialistas, llevamos geólogos, hidrogeólogos, llevamos también al sector privado local en los proyectos que están trabajando para poder charlar sobre los desafíos, pero también las preocupaciones que tiene la comunidad. Es muy importante empezar a hablar de los temas. Argentina no es un país minero, no es un país minero como nuestro vecino Chile, pero queremos serlo. Entonces necesitamos dar esas conversaciones y poner sobre la mesa las preocupaciones que tienen las comunidades, porque la idea de desarrollar la minería es hacerlo de una manera responsable, con estricto cuidado ambiental, pero fundamentalmente que las comunidades sean parte de ese desarrollo. Actualmente Argentina tiene, para que se den una idea, 119 proyectos de lo que va, no solo de litio, sino oro, plata, carbón. Entonces, tiene una cartera que con lo de la transición energética va aumentando, los anuncios de inversiones van aumentando cada día. Entonces, hay una gran presión en todos los niveles. Y cierro con esta reflexión. El otro gran desafío, marqué el tema de la transparencia, marqué el tema de la licencia social. El otro gran desafío es el desarrollo de las capacidades estatales para poder afrontar esta minería que queremos. Muchas veces el Estado y los estados provinciales deben hacer procesos de aprendizaje y eso lleva un tiempo distinto al tiempo de las inversiones, de la erradicación de las inversiones y de la construcción y producción de los proyectos. Y eso aún más podemos decir, se evidencia esa necesidad de fortalecer y pensar las capacidades estatales cuando en contextos como el que está viviendo Argentina, macroeconómicos difíciles, hay una necesidad de inversiones, hay una necesidad de divisas que se necesitan para estabilizar la macroeconomía del país. Entonces, lo dejo ahí porque eso seguramente dispara más preguntas.
Thank you so much, Pamela. That was very helpful. If I can just follow up with a quick follow-up question. You talked towards the end about the capacity and knowledge that needs to be built on the government side as well to monitor and follow up on the development of the mining sector. Could you perhaps just attach a few closing words to how do you ensure that the responsible companies are rewarded for their responsible practice and that you have measures to limit irresponsible practice so that you have a good starting point for those companies that want to operate responsibly?
Gracias. Esto es sumamente importante, cómo trabajar y articular con el sector privado. Hay algo que quiero aclarar. Argentina, en su tradición corta que tiene de minería, en general los proyectos mineros son proyectos que son desarrollados por grandes empresas. Es decir, acá tenemos la minería grande, podríamos decir. No tenemos lo que se llama minería de pequeña o artesanal, ¿no? Esto también ayuda a justamente trabajar con el sector privado, no solo con las empresas directamente, sino con las cámaras, con los sindicatos y con todos los actores que forman parte del entramado de la actividad minera en estándares y buenas prácticas. Y que las empresas vengan ya por sus casas matrices con una cultura vinculada a la transparencia, ayudó mucho a la Argentina a ya partir de una base de estándares y de buenas prácticas sólida. Es decir, por supuesto que tenemos que seguir trabajando porque en el pasado ha habido algunos errores y tenemos que corregir, y en eso vuelvo a plantear este desafío. Es importante ahí el rol provincial para todo lo que tiene que ver con el control estricto de las políticas ambientales que llevan las empresas. Ahí es clave fortalecer a las provincias, a lo que nosotros llamamos las auditorías o la policía minera, para poder llevar adelante un control eficaz y que las comunidades se enteren de ese control. Las provincias realizan audiencias públicas, las provincias tienen su policía o su autoridad minera de control, y nosotros desde el nivel nacional estamos fortaleciéndolos con qué necesidades hay. Principalmente hay necesidades de recursos, es decir, si todos los proyectos, si esta cartera de proyectos todos están en producción, vamos a necesitar muchos recursos capacitados, muchos recursos y mucha articulación en todos los niveles. Acá trabajamos con las áreas de ambiente provinciales, con el área de ambiente de nación, las áreas mineras y todos los organismos de control o de auditoría que tienen los gobiernos provinciales, que muchas veces están de la mano de las autoridades judiciales y nacionales. Este es un gran desafío. Sabemos que partimos de una buena base por esta cultura, pero creo que ahí, con herramientas como EITI, como un estándar como EITI, donde te comento, en los 2 reportes que tuvimos, el 100% de las empresas mineras reportó. Entonces me parece que hay una voluntad del sector privado en hacer las cosas bien. Hay una mirada muy estricta desde los gobiernos provinciales y del gobierno nacional en que se hagan las cosas bien, porque es la única manera de poder desarrollar la actividad que nosotros queremos, ¿no? La actividad minera que nosotros queremos.
Thank you so much, Pamela. That was really, really interesting to hear your thoughts on that. I think, Rachel, I'll turn to you to see if we have a question from the audience, and then we could have a little final exchange from the different panelists, perhaps around that.
Great.
Oh.
My apologies. Thank you, Maya. We do have a question from Laura in the audience, and her question is, what can companies and governments investing in renewables in countries without adequate safeguards, what can they do to promote good governance is how I'm going to phrase it, but she was particularly interested in protecting local communities as well.
Great. Perhaps I can turn that question to the first few panelists first to see if either Phil or Kate would like to. Then we'll start with you, Phil, and then I'll turn to you, Kate, for a follow-up comment.
Thanks. No, it's a great question. I would just say this really, that first of all, you've heard, I think from Kate in particular, that companies can play a fundamentally important role in all the places where they are investing and rolling out renewables. Their own due diligence models are fundamentally important to this, the opportunity and the need to speak to rights holders, to consult directly with them. Far too many times we're seeing, a situation where communities find that there is a security forces are being brought in to remove them from the land, precisely because already the land has been given by the state, saying this is state land, nobody lives there, you can take this for renewable energy projects, only to find, of course, and therefore, the calculation, the return to investors is substantial, only to find that actually there's a whole set of communities there that have never been recognized by the state. So it's in those situations where due diligence, getting to the site, speaking to the people and understanding where they are is fundamentally important. And of course, alongside that, companies can have human rights defenders and environmental rights defenders policies, whistleblower policies, so that they can hear when there are concerns being expressed and risks being identified by those on the ground who know where the risks are. But equally, I think the question is important because it speaks to the fundamental importance, not just of investors and companies, but also of states themselves. And that's why the European Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, to use its proper title, is fundamentally important, because that is going to also change the calculus of risk in boardrooms for companies that perhaps want to cut corners, want to find the way in which they can maximize return to investors. Just as Kate was saying, those trade-offs that are constantly there. And the due diligence model will fundamentally change that calculus of risk, because there will be civil liabilities with substantial penalties. But there should also be, I think, again, as Kate was saying, incentives. And that's also that fundamental issue of realigning business incentives so that they do ensure, and this is where Pamela's comments were also important, where we can make sure that the key incentives around public procurement, about export credit guarantees and all these other things are fundamentally aligned to responsible business conduct.
Thanks a lot, Phil. Kate, some thoughts from you on that question?
Yeah, well, I would definitely say all of the above on what Phil just said. Absolutely agree. And I suppose to add a little bit more to that, I would say that for private sector, really we need to think about who our communities are, who we're accountable to. I think for too long there's maybe this temptation to think that our communities are those close to our assets once they're already in operation or once they're being constructed, but actually, the buck stops with us when it comes to our supply chain too. So we need to think about who are the communities close to our suppliers' assets, and who are the communities close to the places where there's the raw mineral and metal extraction as well. I think that actually Scotland can provide a nice example of where governments are thinking in a bit more of a rounded way on what a just transition means. So the Scottish Government actually set up a Just Transition Commission, which involves commissioners from across private sector, trade unions, NGOs, other really wide and diverse range of stakeholders. And what they have been tasked with doing is really interrogating every part of Scottish Government policy as we move towards net zero, to make sure that we have net zero central to everything from energy to agriculture, but also that there's the just and fair focus on that as well. So there was the first commission was set up to really pin down those recommendations, and now it's all about action and really getting experts in the room and taking evidence from the people that are impacted. And absolutely that means communities, all sorts of different communities and workers as well. So I think if we could see more of that elsewhere in the world, and especially in in the places where they'll be particularly impacted by the mining of minerals and metals needed for renewables, that would be a really powerful approach.
Thank you so much, Kate. That's really, really helpful to hear those thoughts from both of you. I think I'll just ask you, Rachel, if there's, I think we have time for one more question, and perhaps we can pick one that it is relevant to draw on Jency and Pamela's thoughts on.
Thank you, Maya. So another question that we had from our registration was around corruption. So to what extent we're seeing corruption risks emerge in the renewable energy and transition mineral sectors, and what are the implications of this for the prospects of delivering a just transition? Thank you.
So we'll finish on that slightly complicated question. It's a complex topic, but I don't know, Pamela or Jency, would you like to share some reflections? Either of you? We'll start with you, Jency. A quick reply from you, and then we'll get Pamela in to wrap up for us.
So let's say that I can respond to both questions, because I have an idea that if you want to invest in a third country, first of all, you have to guarantee the standard of the country. And for guaranteeing the standard of the country, it's better to be an EITI country. Because as you already know, most of the investors that are coming are asking if this country is an EITI country or no. So my opinion is that at the moment that the country is part of an EITI initiative, it can guarantee that it is more transparent on the, informing the public citizens, and also informing all the actors that want to invest in that country. And for sure, this can give a guarantee in the future that it can lower the risk of corruption, and for sure it can give more protections to the civil to people that are in these countries, and to give to them more possibilities of profiting from their renewable sources inside the country.
Thank you very much, Jensi. And Pamela, last thought from you on that question?
Este es un punto clave, la vinculación del desarrollo de una actividad no solo social y ambientalmente responsable, sino además la vinculación con una actividad que respete las normas y que sea éticamente responsable. Y acá hay que trabajar fuertemente el sector privado y gobierno. Lo que nosotros venimos haciendo es, en primer lugar, sumar como parte del grupo multipartícipe a la Oficina Anticorrupción y trabajar con ellos específicamente. Ellos tienen un registro de integridad, y trabajar con ellos la articulación con ese registro y con las empresas mineras que operan en la Argentina. Y por otro lado, Argentina forma parte de un programa de EITI con Open Ownership sobre beneficiarios finales, donde en una primera instancia hicimos un relevamiento de la información que tiene el Estado Nacional vinculado a quiénes son los beneficiarios finales de las empresas mineras. Hay mucho por trabajar en esto. Y creo que la única manera de realmente de consolidar una actividad responsable, pero que tenga algo fundamental, que tenga ese consenso social, es trabajar fuertemente en esta línea, ¿no? Porque la gran pregunta es, bueno, ¿qué se hace con, o a dónde va las ganancias del sector? Entonces, más allá de transparentar y mostrar los flujos de los gobiernos provinciales, que ese es el otro desafío que nosotros tenemos, pero lo que venimos trabajando a nivel nacional es mostrar también al sector. Entonces, ahí, de nuevo, hay una voluntad de trabajar, y Argentina está sumamente comprometido en esta línea con el sector que está invirtiendo en el país.
Thank you so much, Pamela. I think you pick up on several really relevant themes there right at the end, which incidentally have also been, I think, on the list of topics that those of us that have engaged a bit in this discussion with the EITI in recent months see as really relevant points to pick up from the historic work of EITI in extractives and mining, that can also be of real importance for the renewable space. Beneficial ownership, as you mentioned, is one of those topics that cuts right across, and which, due to its very nature, is impossible for companies to solve on their own, and it's also impossible for governments to solve on their own, as topics around hidden beneficial ownership and tax evasion are by their very nature cross-jurisdictional. So I think those are really good themes to end on as we wrap up the hour here. And I've certainly really enjoyed hearing the perspectives of the different panelists involved in the debate today. I think you collectively paint an optimistic but also cautious picture about the range of challenges that we have ahead of us as a sector. And I think really a good illustration of the collective interests that we have as different stakeholders in making sure that this sector is not marred by the challenges of the past, but can avoid that negative phase and move more quickly towards a responsible standard right across the board. So thank you so much for sharing your perspectives. I'll hand back to you, Joanna, to close us off.
Thank you so much, and what a great note to finish on. And thank you, a huge thanks, Maya, to you for moderating and leading us through this discussion, and to our fantastic panelists, Phil, Kate, Jency, Pamela. It's been really inspiring to hear your thoughts. I think a few very quick reflections from my side. I mean, first, around how timely, urgent this discussion is. Second, I've been struck by the level of clarity, the level of consensus on some of the solutions to the emerging challenges we're facing here, emerging and very real challenges. And third, also just very inspiring to hear the practical actions that can be taken now. Of course, we need systemic actions and systemic change, but also using EITI and other existing mechanisms, including company due diligence, to meet the demand for information, to meet the demand for dialogue, and to really do that in a way that is tailored to local conditions. So it's been fantastic to hear those country examples. Certainly we as the EITI and together with our partners have a lot of work to do on this topic. I can see that, and we'll be taking it forward for certain, especially in the period between now and our major stakeholder gathering, the EITI Global Conference, which will take place in Senegal